Weather Inspector. Thanks for coming to watch and listen to all the goodies that we've put together and all the little snapshots from biking. This course involves living off of your bike for 28 days, which is talking about in the car today. We're like, that is like a pretty insane thing to be able to say that you've done, to be like, I've lived off my bike for this amount of time. Yeah, we had our first car ride today, which was pretty sweet. Yeah, I'll let you guys take it away. Yeah, you're like students. What do we do to move slides?
We have that back here, so just somebody wave your arm and we can switch slides.
I put the clicker up there. Okay, clicker.
Oh, clicker's on that too.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our presentation of Cycle the Rockies. So basically, today we're going to be talking a little bit about our journey across Montana. So we started in Billings and then we ended in Glacier National Park. And it was just a month full of adventure and a lot of guest speakers, a few of which we'll be talking about today, and a whole lot of photos. Some funny, some serious, and just to give you a little snapshot into our experience and all the wonderful things we've learned this month. So enjoy. Gotta start introducing. So yeah. Forgot what I was going to do. So I am from Longmont, Colorado. I'm a junior next year at Williams College, and I'm studying political science.
I'm Evelyn. I'm from Appleton, Wisconsin. I attend UW-Madison. I'm going to be a junior in the fall, and I'm studying environmental research engineering.
I'm Tony. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and I also go to UW-Madison, and I'll be a sophomore in the fall studying wildlife ecology.
My name's Eileen. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin as well. I go to UW-Madison. I'll be a senior this fall studying special education.
I'm Ethan. I am from New York. I go to Madison as well. I'm studying ecology, and I'll be a junior this fall.
Okay, so this is just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we did on our course. So we started down here on the right in Billings, Montana, and we cycled about 600 miles over the course of a month, ending in West Glacier National Park. We met with a lot of awesome guest speakers along the way. We learned from all of their wisdom and knowledge that they had to share with us, and we were talking a lot about climate and energy production specifically in Montana. So it was a really cool experience to be able to meet with people in the community who are actively involved in these things, who are being affected by climate change, by climate impacts, and have a huge stake in these conversations. So we got to talk to a lot of really cool people along the way, and we're going to share a little bit about what we learned from them.
Okay. So when we started off in Billings, we met with Ed Gulick, and he is an architect for the Highlands Architects. We just biked. That was our first bike. It was super short, and we biked to his office, and it was super cool. And I'll try to buzz through these because there's a lot that we learned. But he told us about building green, which basically means how much better the building is than like the building codes. And he talked a lot about walkability and how that changes what a city is like. And there's 6 principles that he talked about, which were all super important. So the first one is about reusing and like restoring existing buildings instead of demolishing and rebuilding, because remodeling takes so much less energy and it has such less impact on the environment. And then the second principle is to create meaningful spaces that you feel good in, because then you'll want to take care of the space because it's a space that you love and appreciate. And then, yeah, talk a lot about walkability, which has so many benefits. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but it decreases construction costs. It like the main thing it really does, it like improves safety and it builds community and connection. And yeah, and then next one is achieving high performance buildings, which he talked a lot about using the integrated design process, which is considering the city and the building as a whole, instead of just parts, which we'll kind of get into that later too. And then he also talked about there's a 4-step energy strategy, which considers the high performance, recycling, waste heat, supplying remaining needs like lighting, like air conditioning efficiently, and then maximizing the rest of energy on renewables. And he also talked about pushing the envelope, which basically means that conflict, it's okay to have conflict because struggle is necessary for change. And then the 6th concept is that you shouldn't wait for there to be a change that happens, you have to be the change.
So the next leg of our journey was onto Shepherd, where we met with Steve Charter, who is a regenerative rancher. And it was such a wonderful first guest speaker because I think it really gave us an insight into what the coming month is going to be like. For me personally, he challenged a lot of my preconceived notions about ranching. I had this pretty singular view of this kind of destructive industry, but he really challenged that and showed me there's a lot more to ranching, and especially to regenerative ranching than I initially thought. Instead of this like destruction of land, it can be like this really beautiful symbiotic relationship between plants and animals and people as well. So I think that was just a lovely way to start this journey by discussing these concepts that really carried through of like regenerative farming, regenerative practices. And yeah, here is a picture of us learning how to laugh. So that was a lot of fun. It's a lot harder than it's actually. Yeah. So that was our first big ride. I think a lot of us were kind of unstable on our bikes, but it was a lot of fun.
All right, so this is Signal Eco Line. This was on our way from Steve Charter to Uganda. And honestly, this line like is it uses very clean mining practices. The code is very clean. It's very environmentally friendly. But like that's what we're told when we first walked in. And later on, we found out that just not there's money laundering involved. There's a Russian oligarchy involved as well, and shell companies as well. And overall, it's just a not very good company. Steve Charter from before, yeah, they stole land from me, so they drilled in a way where it basically undercut this demand, and that wasn't wiping the ball, so they got away with it, and it wasn't poisoning the underground water aquifer, so that was damage to the local ecosystem as well. So overall, not very good company, but it was otherwise. So, yeah.
So after the coal mine, we stayed at a lonely campsite on this wonderful river. Throughout the course session, at the beginning of the course, we didn't think that we would be able to get here into the meeting without someone coming and talking to us. And I think that just really goes to show, like, the culture in Montana just very like neighborliness. Everyone wants to chat. So we got to chat with a fun fellow at this campsite. And then woke up here and we traveled and we met with Elizabeth Wood in Roundup, Montana. Elizabeth is the co-founder of Montana's Alternative Energy Resources Organization, and one of the co-directors and creator of the organization's New Western Energy Show, which toured all of Montana in 1976, educating Montanans on renewable energy. And she talked to us a lot about just having fun with the work you're doing. At least for me, that's not something that I've heard a lot in my college experiences, to have fun with things. So that was a really impactful piece of wisdom that she shared with us. She talked about how she the Western Energy Show made a really big impact because they used humor to connect people, where connection may have been challenging otherwise. So just kind of got us thinking about the ways that we can take action, and make sure that we have fun with it all.
And then we sort of have a long leg of our journey. I think the next couple of days were some of our harder days of biking. After speaking with Elizabeth, we had some really hard steep gravel riding to do. We met with some lovely hosts. We had our first showers, which was really exciting. And then we had our W day, which we were facing a lot of headwind consistently around like 25 miles per hour with gusts up to 45 miles per hour. It was a long, long day. But after that, we kept going. We made it to Helena, which was another day of really focused riding on very, very busy roads. And we met Durf. Durf Johnson works for the Montana Environmental Information Center, and he works a lot with lobbying for environmental change and just reviewing a lot of environmental policy. So we learned so much from him. I remember as we were talking, I'm just thinking about how exhausting this work must be. But it was interesting because he told us sort of how he can continue in this line of work, not lose any steam, and sort of keep a positive attitude. And it was pretty similar to what Elizabeth Wood actually told us. It was just enjoy the work that you do. That's really important. And he talked a lot about lobbying and how it's really important to connect with people where they're at. You know, he interacts with a lot of different people. He talks about how there are more like 4 main political parties in Montana instead of 2, and how he has to work with a lot of different opinions, and how he can sort of like try to garner a little bit of positive environmental impact by sort of being a good negotiator and being a person who can interact with a lot of different kinds of people. He also talked about how important it is to like how they fight against narrowing the review, which I thought was a really interesting concept. And it's the idea that in a lot of policy, they try to narrow the scope about environmental impact, and that's something that they're fighting against. It's really, really interesting.
So this is about a restaurant, Yellowstone. He basically he put a big advocate for basically the research to consumer systems where, you know, like you have a ranch and you raise a cow. The cow should be slaughtered and it goes sells immediately to the customer or the restaurant, and the restaurant is the customer. So these are the middlemen that the big corporation are really control the system. So that's what he's all about. And his whole ethos is that we cannot have a regenerative system if we don't. I mean, we can't have regenerative ranching if we don't have a regenerative system. So the whole system will not change for, you know, like good practices to thrive, because we really right now regenerative ranching is really small. It's not at a big scale yet, and probably because in a system it really discourages that. And yeah, he's all about it, and he really focuses on how the people should really like live on land, learn about the land, and in return, the land will also help them to grow.
Stayed at a wonderful spot called NQB City, and had a lot of fun hanging out with you.
We had a sauna. It was pretty great. Then we made it to Augusta, and stayed at Hal Herring's house and met with him. And that was another really, really tough journey. That was our first 50-mile day. And it was raining and we had some gravel. We had a little bit of a run-in with a cow on the road. Had to avoid that for a little while. That added some time. And then, so we got to Hal's house and he was talking to us a little bit about
water scarcity, which is a little ironic because then the next day we were absolutely dumped on. You can see our rain jackets and all of our wet shoes that we were trying to warm by the fire. Absolutely poured rain. But when we met with Hal, we talked a lot about Montana history, which was really, really interesting. And we learned a lot about how the 1872 mining law and the formation of the Bob Marshall Wilderness still affects Montana today, and how it's a really, really important thing in the amount of water that this part of Montana can have, and just quality in general with ranching, because we talked about a lot of public lands and how ranchers use those to graze cattle or other livestock, and how you can sort of work with those public lands in conjunction with your own land that has a lot of water on it and cheaply graze cattle. So it was really interesting to sort of hear about the history that ties into ranching life and life in Montana in general today. So yeah, we talked a lot about so many things. We talked ranching, we talked about Marshall Wilderness, we talked also about the Clean Water Act and how you have to look at like point source water pollution. So we just talked about a really wide scope of topics, and it was really, really interesting to hear his perspective. Learn.
Okay, yeah, so then after Yellowstone, we rode to Shodo, which we actually don't have any pictures from it. I feel like there's kind of a reason for that, but we went to a feedlot called the North Montana Feeders, and we spoke to Callan Yeager, who's the current owner there. But yeah, going into the feedlot, I feel like none of us really knew like what process was exactly, like how it works, and like yeah, like Ethan was talking about how it's like, you know, people don't want like this middleman in like the process of getting their food. But yeah, it's good to know where the food comes from. So it was really quite enlightening. And actually some of the cattle that's in that feedlot goes to Old Salt, the company, and they use that meat. But basically we learned about the process. So basically the people in the feedlot, the company, they buy cattle from ranchers and those cows, they start off grass fed, and then they come to the feedlot, and then they get started, they get vaccinated, they get tagged, they get dehorned, castrated, like all these kinds of things. And they get sorted, and they get put into these small, you know, kind of confinements. They're outside, but their diet switches from grass to roughage, which is like hay and silage. So basically they're in there for 90 to 300 days, just putting on weight and like muscle and fat. And they're just trying to maximize growth like as fast as possible until they are shipped off to the slaughterhouse, which we didn't talk about that, but it's just interesting to see the feedlot and to see what that process was like and what it looked like there compared to what we saw in ranches, which is way different.
Yeah, and so
Next we rode to the Blackfeet Reservation. We were in Browning. And we met with Gerald Wagner, who's the director of the Blackfeet Environmental Program. And he just talked to us a lot about what his program does, what the Blackfeet people are doing on the reservation in terms of climate action and environmental protection. So we learned a lot about that, which was really interesting. We also learned a lot about just how climate change and climate impacts are impacting the reservation and Indigenous peoples all over Montana. And he just talks a lot about the importance of making sure that Indigenous folks are at the forefront of every decision that's being made about climate impacts and climate change. and how it's really, really important to listen to Indigenous folks. He also talked about this idea of thinking ahead, this like concept of 7 generations. So every decision you make today, you're thinking about how that's going to impact people 7 generations from you. So not just thinking about us in the present and how it's going to impact now, but thinking very far into the future was a big thing that he talked about. Also just the importance of community. All of the work that he's doing there and his program's doing there is very community oriented, focusing on empowering the community, empowering his neighbors to take action and control what's around them. And then also he left us with just the awesome message of like making sure that your heart is always in this work, because that allows you to have a greater impact all around you. So this is us on our way.
And so the last speaker we'll be talking about today is actually here with us tonight, Amanda. So Amanda, it was so wonderful. She drove all the way up to Glacier to meet with us, and she told us all about her experiences as a firefighter and writer. And I think, again, a lot of my like preconceived notions were challenged, which is so like the point of this whole thing. I used to think about fire like it's a blight to our forests, to our ecosystems. But like what Amanda shared is that a lot of ecosystems need fire, just for habitat, for wildlife, and for maintaining the forest's health. And it was also looking at like the future of fire and how we can manage it and adapt to an increasingly hotter and hotter climate where fire is on the rise. And sort of this conversation we had kind of led to a through line through all of our guest speakers and through our entire journey, which is about, as Eileen mentioned, just looking into the future, looking 7 generations from now. Because one of the main things that we all notice is that a lot of policy, a lot of decision making is really short-sighted. It's about these gains in the near future. It's your kids, it's your grandkids, that's who you're trying to benefit. But kind of the conclusion that we came to is what we need to do is we need to look further ahead. We can't just make these sort of myopic and short-sighted decisions. We need to think about 7 generations and think about how we can help people who are like 300 years from now, because otherwise we're all like, it's just gonna be very poorly. Yeah. So yeah, just kind of like that's one of our main conclusions. We just need to be a little more. We need to think more ahead. So yeah.
Yeah, and then our next takeaway was about systems thinking, which was, it was a concept that was brought up like about halfway through-ish. But it's basically thinking about any kind of system as a whole instead of thinking about like one part in specific, or it's just thinking about how each part affects one another, how it interacts with one another, which it's also a concept that Indigenous peoples they use this way of thinking. And Emma was talking about it, like the 7 generations thing that plays into systems thinking as well. And it's just like thinking about living in balance with the ecosystem, the land, the people, just interconnectedness essentially.
Speaking of that, we talk about paradigm shifts. So that paradigm shift is that it doesn't work forever. And eventually it can be stopped out. And for that, changes will happen, right? So branching, for example, right now branching is not very sustainable. And regenerative branching is a lot more sustainable. So trying to get farmers to shift your idea from, oh, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, they all branched a certain way. It's hard to get them to shift that idea of like, oh, it worked for 3 generations, water change by doing that. So it's kind of hard to get them to change our whole ideas for the new one. There's that uncertainty, but I think it's not a necessity, but it would be great if you can consider with that kind of change and how it will eventually benefit us.
Yeah, and another really big through line for us was just to have fun with what you're doing. I think starting with Elizabeth again, just talking about how you can't really make any change if you're not taking care of yourself and if you're not taking care of your community. And so having fun and doing what you're passionate about and following breadcrumbs of joy is really, really important. And that's how you're going to be able to make change and sustainable change because you're sustaining yourself. And speaking of fun, we had a lot of it on this trip. A lot of haircuts, Afro yoga, photo shoots. You can see baby in the corner. Union. Yeah, just we had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I think I did. It just made we have to exit out. Maybe get back to it.
Maybe we can at the end then. Or should we?
We gotta do it now.
Okay. Okay.
Which you are.
Yeah.
We have something that we want to share.
Should I grab the music? On my phone?
We can
Or wait.
reload that. And go to the last slide. Like reload that.
Oh.
There we go. I got y'all. Hold on. No.
You want to give me the context of why you're saying this?
Wait, I feel like
Or sing it first and then explain?
I don't think I can explain.
Okay.
So we were at Al's house, and as it was downpouring, we had some leaky tents, and it was a little wet. So some of us slept in this barn that we had on his house. And we were exploring and saw a little bit of like rat poop, and we were thinking like, is someone gonna get hantavirus? So seriously, we sort of started improvising a little bit of a song.
Yeah.
We don't need those lyrics up there.
Yeah, beats great.
Stay on the bike.
Yeah. Yeah. So baby, just slip a little virus in me, baby. I've been off of this girl, onto baby, so scurry down the chimney tonight. Onto baby, the 56 was deadly disease. I paid up for you, dear. So baby, so scurry down the chimney tonight. Think of all the disease you spread. Think of all the mice that I might have missed. Next year I'll be just as gross if you choose me as your host. To baby, I want your coffin and that's not a lot. Been a vector all year, on to baby, so scurry down the chimney tonight. On to honey, one little thing I really need, fever. And some shivers and chills, on to baby, so scurry down the chimney tonight. On security and fill my stocking with a Kleenex or two. Make your way up my spine. Let's scurry down the chimney tonight. Long and free, my body. This is sound from the CDC. I really do. Believe in you, I see in you, believe in me. On to baby, forgot to mention one little thing, drawings. Why don't we on the floor, on to baby, so scurry down the chimney tonight.
Alright, we're closing all, I wrote a poll for y'all, and this applies to us, but it also applies for everyone else, and, 7 travelers sat up on the shore, gazing into yonder deep up in the sky, warm views brushed the tranquil waters where heavens lingered in reflection. Before them stood the mountain peaks, piercing the sky again never leaving, a quiet reminder that even those who remain together may climb different summits. They wonder where tomorrow will lead, which dream will endure, which paths will diverge, and who they will become. As daylight faded into silence, they rose with no certainty, only the quiet hope that beyond every horizon wait another dawn, and another version of themselves.
Before you guys break, can we have any questions for you as well? Can you stay up in the front?
Ethan, you got a great poem from the live stream chat. They love that.
So yeah, typically the end of presentations, anybody in the audience that has questions or anybody who's watching from afar can also type questions into the chat, and we'll read them aloud and have it all answered.
I have a question. In visiting the feedlot, did that, as if you are meat eaters or were, did that change your perspective at all?
I think I mean, it for sure did, since it was, I think it was all of our first times being in a feedlot. But I guess from my point of view, at least, like, I remember like in Wisconsin, like we would drive past, like, we would know they're feedlots, but they were like in a big building, and I knew that the cattle there were way more confined. And I guess in all like feedlot considerations, like this one was like, I mean, Old Salt, the company, they chose to have this feedlot supply their meat. So I guess like knowing that that was like one of the best feedlots, it maybe made us feel a little icky about, you know, where we get our food from. But yeah, it was definitely eye-opening.
So I apologize for coming in late. You may have talked about this earlier, but can you tell me what regenerative ranching actually is? Well, regenerative ranching is basically, so how rural ranching works is that you have a bunch of field, right? Cows will graze it, and usually you like complete graze a field and move on to the next immediately that field. And maybe you have a field that is hay all, so hay, graze. So that's how we sustainable, because you know the grass doesn't have time to regrow. So regenerative ranching is basically a process where you would basically it's more labor intensive, it's more manual in the sense that you manually move cows from pasture to pasture before the fields can completely be empty. So you do like graze a little bit, and then you move to the next, graze a little bit, move to the next. And in that process of moving, the cows will do manure, and those come to the ground, which help the seeding and the manure really like the soil absorb that. So regenerative ranching is essentially where you can not preserve, but you could sustain a land a lot longer than normal ranching. But it's also a lot more dairy intensive, and machines usually cannot do the job, so it's a lot more labor.
One interesting thing that we talked to regenerative ranchers, and like everything I've heard about regenerative ranching, it's like always like more financially beneficial than regular or like typical ways of doing it, which I thought was really interesting. Like we talked to one regenerative rancher who spoke about how like his family ranch was really struggling, and then he switched to regenerative practices, and they've been doing like really well ever since. So another really great benefit for the people in the community.
Thank you.
Yeah, one from the audience at home. You saw so much of the state. Were any of your preconceived notions or stereotypes challenges during your journey?
I think it was really interesting to learn about ranching, honestly. I also coming from Wisconsin, didn't really understand the process or how it worked. And I really appreciated almost seeing the full circle of it. Talking to regenerative ranchers, going to the feedlot, and then also speaking to Cole, who owns Full Salt, about like the harvesting process. So I think that really, I learned a lot, and it was way different than I thought, because coming into this trip, I thought that ranches, you have the cattle, you know, they bred, they ate, and then they were completely slaughtered. But we found out about like grain finish, grass finish, you know, the fact that they're transported a lot actually after the field, and you know, about sort of their whole life cycle of ranching process, which I had no idea about. It was really, really interesting.
Has anyone got seen the show Yellowstone?
Yeah.
So for me, my professional Montana is beautiful pictures and sorry, Yellowstone. And to come here, it really, travel across Montana and really like going to small towns, talk to the locals and really like, understand how they're living, like just observe similarities and differences to the show. Like one thing that was stood out to me is a battle, the political battle between the ranchers, the city goers, the natives, and how that, like that interaction between really conflicts of politics of one thing which I really found was really fascinating.
I was just struck by how kind everyone was. Like everyone wanted to help us out. People like stopped on the side of the road to give us water and snacks. They like opened their homes to give us showers. It's very powerful.
So I have a question. You talked a little bit about environmental policy and meeting with one of the advocacy groups in Helena, and how it sounded like one of the strategies for that group was to just increase environmental review and make sure that review is happening and those kind of pieces. I'm wondering how, at the same time, like the energy system that we use today needs an incredible investment in new wind farms, in new solar arrays, in all of those types of technologies. And I'm wondering how you reconcile the need for environmental review and also the need for new construction if we're going to shift and make that energy transition happen, and how you think about that, how you grapple with that. Like if something's stuck in an environmental review process for 5 years, those are solar panels that aren't getting built versus, and during that time, we're going to use the existing energy infrastructure. So like, how do you reconcile those pieces or think about those pieces through this course?
Yeah, meeting with Dirk Johnson was really, really eye-opening. It sort of opened my eyes to the whole political side of environmental work. As someone who's in STEM, I always think about that side. And so it was really sort of very overwhelming for me, sitting there listening to him, hearing about all the work that he's doing, but also how slow it is and how difficult it is to get these processes through, and how this whole system that has been built is built to not have environmentally friendly practices or policies. So, and I'm not sure if I'm totally answering well, but it was just very interesting to sort of hear about, yes, like if you're trying to halt something and place it under environmental review, like some things aren't being built, but at the same time, they're trying almost to have like as much of the long-term impact as possible, trying to sort of shift these systems away from very located, like, for example, this might be a more concise way to answer, but he talked about how in a lot of not very environmentally friendly energy practices, they focus only on the site and the environmental impacts at the site. And that's something that they're trying to change because they don't consider air quality of people outside of this plot of land. They don't consider water quality far away from, for example, like a coal mine. And so I think for the long-term impacts, it could be really, really positive, but it is like frustrating short. I don't know if anyone else has any.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting for me to think about like these policies in place that don't just prevent like what I would consider more like negative environmental impacts, but they also prevent like renewables and sustainable energy. So it's like kind of going back to your question, how do you weigh this like policy process when it's sort of equally, not equally, I think it's maybe in fact harder for renewables to be implemented financially, like the frameworks just simply aren't there, whereas for like fossil fuels, I mean, that's what we've been using for so long at this point that the infrastructure is there to keep developing and to increase fossil fuel usage. But it's like, if we don't have this red tape, then I feel like it's almost like a wild, like it's like a wild west when it comes to energy development, because I think the same policies to a certain extent that prevent like renewable energy also are there to prevent the expansion of like fossil fuels. And so that's a difficult question to answer because like how do you sort of dismantle these barriers without also dismantling barriers for fossil fuels? And I'm not really sure how to like make that calculus, but like that was a sort of an interesting question along this journey, like how do you promote one while simultaneously like phasing out the other? Like there is so much momentum in that direction.
Trying to figure it out.
And also obviously the other ones that, you know, mining industry has historically been very fun, like even modern day, you know, like mines like in Roundup, most people are employed by the civil peak mine, like their livelihood depends on the mine. And that, you know, goes for a lot of people when they work in the mine, like the mine is surviving. So to phase out these mines, we're losing a lot of jobs. We're especially shutting down some towns because the entire economy is dependent on mines. But at the same time, Montana has a lot of potential for renewable energy. So it's just kind of like weighing the dice where, you know, we could do more energy. And if we face those old energy sources out, we're also kind of just like leaving some people behind. So that's also a question of that is also a question that we're trying to ask, where how do we make sure that people don't really suffer from this transition? How can, you know, fully integrate this system in a way where it's beneficial to everyone.
We talked a lot about how there's not a black and white, like I think of like one of my main takeaways from this course is that there's so much nuance in all of these conversations. Like it's not this or that, but there's this like incredible gray area that we all have to live in, and it prompts a lot of really difficult questions.
Another question from the audience at home from Bodie, another WRFI alum. After meeting regenerative ranchers, do y'all think it is feasible to have regenerative ranching on a large scale, or just as practices large farms can adopt?
I do believe it's possible. Now, I'm not talking about ranching, like no, regenerative farming has been implemented widely in South America and conservation. So it's the same concept where, you know, you're not degrading soil, you grow everything systems that, you know, regenerate the soil. So right now, regenerative ranching is implemented in a small scale. Again, because of the paradigm shift, I believe that if enough people believe that this system will work, and people are willing to try it, and the system will thrive. And if enough people try it, then the big corporation or the system will have to adapt to adjust to the new producers. Because if the producers change as a whole, then the middleman also have to change according to the producers.
This is a question for me, not from the audience at home. I'm very curious about this encounter with the cow that you had on the way to Augusta. This is a fun story?
Yeah.
Okay.
We experienced some cows out of fences multiple times on our journey. But this was the biggest one. Before it was just like a couple calves. But this one, we were biking on a gravel road. We were on maybe mile 40. We were all tired. And there's this massive cow in the road. And when you start biking towards her, she starts running forward and like kind of freaking out, trying to run up and get into the barbed wire fence. It was just, it must have gone on for about a half a mile. We tried walking past her with our bikes. Eventually we biked again and she turned around and made it behind us, but it was definitely captured our attention, put us a little bit on edge. We were worried that something was gonna happen to her or us, and it was a lot, yeah.
We also had a puppy that followed us for like 3 miles. And it ran with us onto Highway 2. And so we had to call animal control to get someone to pick up the puppy, but it was not going away from us. It was really cute. Yeah.
You tell them about the field.
Oh, Ethan, you want to talk about the board?
Okay, so when we were at Stewards, I set up my tent, I walked over to the steam pad, and of course, like walked up, like 3 or 4 people walked up, they collectively like looked around my fence, sniffed it, sort of biting me. Oh, I'm sort of like, that's it.
Yeah.
You know?
But you still got it.
Yeah.
Lots of animals.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's give a round of applause for Cycle the Rockies. And give us just a moment while Restoration Ecology gets on up, and then we'll get started. I have an accident. For now. I don't see these are nothing about it. Think about it. Right. That's interesting.
Murphy's first single.
I was over there. It's a
It's a whole album of the virus being parodied. And
All right, I think they're ready. Hit the record button.
yeah. Right.
Good.
Good.
Hey, hi everyone. We are the leaders of Restoration Ecology section number 1. We just want to give a quick introduction before our awesome group speaks. We've had such a pleasure of being together for the last 3 weeks, and it's been such a blast. So many adventures, and I think we both shared, like, we feel really proud and excited about the work that we've done together and this time that we've spent. And we're really excited for everyone to get to hear a little bit about all the brilliant things and questions that everyone's been mulling over for the past 3 weeks.
I'm Zach. I'm one of the other instructors on Restoration Ecology. All of the students get into the nitty-gritty of what we talked about, but I want to give a quick shout out to Dan Spencer, who's here in the crowd, who was a big character of our trip. By a moment of great serendipity, or maybe fate, depending on your worldview, we ran into Dan on our backpacking trip in the middle of the snow crests. And Dan, big supporter of working, particularly of this course, and thanks for letting us stay with Canada. So,
I'm glad the kitchen window was open.
All right. My name is Michael Confluence, and I'm from Bozeman, Montana, but I'm going here at the University of Montana for school. I'd like to start us off with an event towards the beginning of our trip. Early on our course, we met with the Montana Conservation Corps and Big Full Watershed Committee and made beaver dam analytes in California Creek, kind of nearby Buttes. The goal of this was of capturing water and inducing sediment flow down the stream. And basically to return this stream to the state it was in before heavy logging and mining occurred in this region. Now, a little bit of context, the Big Hole Watershed Committee works with stakeholders to manage the waterways around the Big Hole River and increase these systems. That day, we toiled away, making dams out of hemp and sod. And for the next week, that's all I really thought about it, just the product of our work. That was until we had a reading by one Eric Higgs, who set out to define what food restoration was. While reading Higgs's work, I couldn't help myself from comparing his outline to our work on the dams. The first part of Higgs's definition of restoration is that restoration must have an effective plan to have long-lasting impacts while meeting the eco-fidelity of said site. I certainly think that the committee's work on the California Creek met these requirements. Members of the Big Hole Watershed Committee clearly explained their goals and how they would work on the land to achieve these goals. I remember one member, Nolan, also describing how he wanted to get California Creek to a position where they no longer had to intervene in its function. Second, Higgs describes restoration as being quick and economically feasible. Again, I think the Big Hole Watershed Committee touches on these points. Pedro, the executive director, stresses the importance of finding and meeting targeted goals at appropriate times. Another thing Pedro mentioned was that they do not plan for projects that we do not have the funding for. This keeps themselves in the limits of what they can and cannot do. Finally, Higgs says that good restoration touches on the surrounding concepts behind the product site and community. The Big Hole Watershed Committee also addresses these concepts by facilitating community participation, making sure many varying opinions were involved in the planning and labor behind this project, and recognizing the background of the site we worked at. The reason all this really mattered to me is because for the longest time, my concepts of what restoration was and began and ended at the product restoration, the end means. But Higgs showed me how the process matters just as much, if not more, to what good restoration is. And I'll be taking that knowledge with me in my further learnings.
My name is Brooks Whitman. I'm from Fairbanks, Alaska, but I go to Missoula for college at the University of Montana. And I would describe myself as an avid outdoorsman. My family in the interior does this yearly river float on the Reindeer Hill section of the Nana River. So I can barely pronounce that in general. We always stay on the same campsite on that river. So over the course of my life, I've seen so much change within that certain area. And during while we were learning about about a specific concept during our course, it just really resonated with me. And this concept was about novel ecosystems. Within every workday that we had, whether it be at Colster Ranch or working with the Watershed Committee building beaver dam analogs, within every conversation that we had about restoration, there was always the question that arose of what time period to restore the site to, or what an appropriate end goal looked like. Historical fidelity is the concept of figuring out what previous state and time period to restore an ecosystem to. But what if the ecosystem has experienced irreversible change? What if things such as human activity, non-native and invasive species have encroached so much to the point that they have become part of the natural system? The idea of returning an ecosystem to a state untouched by humans erases indigenous management of land and disregards their effect on the land. This is where novel ecosystems come in. During reading, also written by Eric Higgs and a few other co-writers, it defines
Oh. It defines novel ecosystems as the development of ecosystems that differ in composition and or function from present and past systems, and is recognized as an almost inevitable consequence of changing species distributions, environmental alteration through climate change, and land use change. The thing about novel ecosystems is that they are transformed, not necessarily losing the value that they once held, but adapting to changing climate alongside other biotic and abiotic factors. Novel ecosystems fall on a wide spectrum of ecological change. Historically, pre-colonial settlement, there was a range of variability between ecosystem function and management. As changes occurred, hybrid ecosystems arose with a mixed composition and function of how they worked. As new biotic composition was prominently present, ecosystems cross a threshold, reaching the point of irreversibility. These are novel ecosystems, and they're severely altered from their original state. When conducting restoration interventions, identifying this threshold, I believe, is a huge factor within the practice of historical fidelity and how land managers apply it to restoration decisions within ecosystems that they're working with. This leads me to a question or two that I've mulled over the course of the past 3 weeks. What adaptations do we need to make to move with the changed ecosystems instead of against them? Instead of attempting to reverse what has shifted, why are we adapting traditional restoration practices and norms to better fit the ecosystems that they're being applied to? As I mentioned at the beginning, I have seen one specific spot that is near and dear to my heart to be changed over my lifetime. The wetland has imposed itself upon the deciduous forest above it due to the water level increase due to the warming climate. This is just one singular example of the many changed ecosystems I've seen shift over the course of just a handful of years. Novel ecosystems are everywhere, and learning how to answer and ask questions and adapt restoration practices and goals to these ecological transformations, I think, are extremely key in the continuation of restoration.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brody Sheldon. I am from Kennewick, Washington, and I attend Washington State University in Pullman. A course concept that really stuck out to me that we mentioned pretty early on in the course is the concept of nativeness and invasive species. Specifically in aquatic species and fish. I have been an avid outdoorsman and fisherman since I was 3 years old. And so needless to say, coming into that, I was more than eager to find out the impacts and influences that fishing has on restoration projects. Something specific that made me think about this again was meeting with the executive director of the Big Hole Watershed Committee, Pedro Marquez. And he talked about a time when the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Committee decided in an attempt to remove invasive fish species in a section of the Big Hole River, they dammed it off and poured a chemical called rotenone into the river. And what this chemical does is it prevents gill function in any and all fish species that come in contact with it. Now, as you can imagine, it worked well. I mean, I would say even a little too well. It wiped out not only the invasive species, but also all of the native ones. So coming back to the terms native and invasive, there's a huge weight attached to both of these terms. A quote from one of our readings titled Exotic Invasions, Nativism, and Ecological Restoration clarifies by stating, natives are only these organisms that first happen to gain and keep a footing in an ecosystem. Given the takes of these quotes, it made me question, what if what we deem as invasive just hasn't developed a good standing footing in an ecosystem? And we all know the quote, nature finds a way. That was my thought process going into Pedro's story with the rotenone. But after hearing about it a bit more and learning that the species was in fact wiping out all the native West Slope cutthroat, as well as the fact that after the chemical dump, the cutthroat were reintroduced, I sided with him and his decision in assisting the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to dump this chemical. So what I take away from this course is the ability to hear people out and a new appreciation for the people behind the decision making. Overall, I'm really grateful for the new perspective this experience has given me, and will always cherish the ecology work behind aquatic ecosystems.
Hello, I'm Miranda Solomon. I'm from Stoughton, Wisconsin. I go to UW Stevens Point. And a question that I ask is, who are we in this world? Throughout the course, we often talked about values that go into restoration, which brings the question of how we see ourselves in nature. For me, this question appeared when we did our hike in Yellowstone. It was our first morning out there when a lone bison quietly passed through the sagebrush a couple yards away from our tents. And in that moment, I felt I had intruded into something not meant for me. But who was it meant for? Long had indigenous people viewed such scenes as they cultivated the land. And long had Yellowstone been a tourist attraction for its geological features and wildlife. So why didn't I belong? It comes to my values of how humans and nature should interact. Who was I in the multitude of categories that define humans and nature? Well, far from human activities, I was left to ponder as the bison disappeared into the distance. Throughout this course, my values have been challenged and morphed into something for me to continue to figure out. It was a question of who I was in this world before this year, and I still don't know. But I have more tools to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Hi, I'm Ella. I'm from Rhode Island and go to the University of Vermont, and I'm going to talk about backpacking in wilderness areas. So I'm going to start with, what do we think when we hear the word wilderness? Well, many times it's untamed, undomesticated, independent, and untouched by man, which creates a divide between humans and nature. What about travel? This is a significant effect or impact on natural lands by humans. This topic relates to when we had our first backpacking just to the Snowcrest Mountains in the deep backcountry, away from all civilization in the remote area surrounded by nature. This was a quiet experience. It was authentic, and we were embraced in nature with deep connections, with all the life surroundings. As we trekked, we respected the environment, and we left as little of our presence at the campsite as possible. We coexisted and shared the space because we were the distinct species who inhabit this land. I do not view this as trend because we were not disruptive. We only were peaceful observers on and enjoying the land that we also deserve to see. From my perspective and what we learned in class, these Montana areas are untrammeled lands due to the indigenous people who lived amongst the mountains for pre-colonization. This is where the negative connotations of the word wild come in, as indigenous peoples were considered wild and untamed, so their label, but placed in a category with wilderness by the West Glacier. Their land was stolen, and then the Wilderness Act enacted in 1964 was to designate areas of the land to be untouched by humans. This is where the word anthropocentrism comes into play, because humans are always the center of nature and always play a part. So is it truly considered trampling or invading a space, a possible wilderness area, if we have good intentions, is my view when we were back. Wilderness is a complex concept to embrace, especially with its history. With this, despite the difficult history and how problematic the term is, I still value having an intimate experience in the non-human nature. I love understanding more about all forms of life and creating a balance between all the life that shares the earth, as long as we cause no harm to children. As Robin Wolfenberger and Humphrey Whiteley says, I believe we should honor and admire the gifts we receive from the earth. As I move back home, I have a newfound awareness of all the previous and current inhabitants of this land, such as the indigenous peoples and species. We have a right to experience remote areas, to embrace the wilderness and explore the beauty of nature. Although that being said, it is hard to truly know and understand the concept of it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot Isler, and I'm the local of the Bozeman area and the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. I would now like to talk about the first time we encountered bison on ground level while in Yellowstone. So we were hiking into our first camp, and as we were kind of passing through this area, there was very large plains. There's some bison that came and noticed on a bluff about 100 feet away, which was terrifying and also very awe-inspiring. It was also kind of humbling because we realized for the first time they're not behind a painted glass in a car or like in a fence. They're on ground level, and they're just like, oh boy, really hope they don't come down here. But I actually said at the time, well, I would not be brave enough to like go hunt these things, like if I was just here, like, but really people did. And so kind of the question is like, where are these people hunting the bison historically? And obviously those were Native Americans, and they were kind of pushed out of the 1800s to create a pristine, quote unquote, there land where working groups we saw bison. So why were they pushed out? Is kind of the question then. Well, it happened as part of a larger process of colonization that removed natives from the land for settlement and exploitation. In the process of this, bison were also destroyed in kind of an attempt to like essentially start natives out of like being existing. As well, some of these lands were stolen and were set aside as national parks. First was to create a pristine, again, a vision of the old American West that could be used for inspiration and betterment of the people as well as recreation. Bison, as kind of for the forest here, were eventually used as kind of like set pieces for like the old West here, because they were kind of like destroyed them and people were like, wow, they're really cool. Maybe we should keep them around for kind of as the remnants of how cool we were in colonization. This is kind of a stark contrast to how natives managed to interact with these animals. Instead of set pieces, these animals in Yellowstone as a landscape were more like treated as equals and kind of managed accordingly. Like you hunted wisely, you burned maybe in accordance when you should. And after learning this, I kind of have to change perspective because I grew up going to Yellowstone these parks, and I've lived in the area for all of my life here in Yellowstone. So kind of instead of seeing like this unhappening landscape, it's like something I'm like, oh, that's so cool. There's some people out here. I used to start wondering why there's no people out here, and what's the story behind that, and how that kind of park's history has profoundly affected how the public views wildness as like something that people don't exist in. Like there's wildness and then there's us, but clearly that's not the case historically because that's not how it's been. So in kind of the wrap of my story, I kind of returned to the local bison. So as we were leaving, we can kind of see them watching us, which is again, we started probably today. I was just kind of wondering at the future because we had read a lot of stuff on like native land reintroductions to their lands. But we also read a lot about obviously the restoration of bison in Yellowstone and all that with the wolves and everything. So, but one has to ask, is that enough for a species that has had like 6 million across the continent and massive range throughout the entire plains? Like, is that enough to have a population in Yellowstone and some Indian reservations for the survival of the species? So, can't really answer that now because only time will tell.
My name is Sage Starrett. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. One conversation that really stuck out to me was about assisted migration, which is a form of restoration. We looked at a specific case study of the whitebark pines. The whitebark pine is a species of pine tree that are found in subalpine and treeline habitats in Western North America. They're often considered a keystone species, and it is important to note that they depend on a mutualistic relationship with a bird species called the Clark's nutcracker for seed dispersal. Recently, the whitebark pine has been facing a handful of issues that have led humans to consider assisting in the migration of them to a new ecosystem. The most prominent issue is that human-induced climate change is moving the livable range of the whitebark pine more northwards as the climate warms. Another problem is that the whitebark pine face are the mountain pine beetles that kill the trees and are becoming more common with climate change. This goes right along with the white pine blister rust that is a fungus that weakens the trees. When we were backpacking in the snow-crust mountains, we took the time to hike up to a whitebark pine stand near our campsite. As we approached the stand, we noticed all of the dead trees in the area. We struggled to find a whitebark pine that was still alive. The one that we found had the blister rust on it already. That day, we held our class at the pine stand. During our discussion, a Clark's nutcracker began calling from the top of the dead trees. It was a surreal experience that truly connected our class concepts to the real world. Our discussions centered around the question, should we move the whitebark pine, which is fundamentally an ethical question. Your answer to this question depends on the values you hold. An example of this is intrinsic value for the whitebark pine. If we don't assist in the migration of the trees, they will face extinction. But with this fact, the question that arises is single species focus an acceptable conservation strategy? Another issue that arises deals with invasiveness and ecosystem values. Will the whitebark pine become invasive? Will it disturb an already stable ecosystem? This goes along with those who value the historic state of the ecosystems. Values of sentient animals need to be taken into consideration as well. As I mentioned before, the Clark's nutcracker need to be present for the whitebark pine to thrive. This raises issues in itself. The capture and relocation of the birds will inevitably cause stress on the species. One must consider if they value the birds or the trees more. One last thing to consider is the idea of wildness. Is the ecosystem still wild if it is not independent of humans? This is contrasted by the idea that humans are already involved because of the factors like human-induced climate change, the lack of fires in the area, and the white pine close to rust. This specific case study is just one example of the ethical dilemma that is assisted migration. We will have to continue to debate and respond to these ideas as climate change continues to progress.
Hi, my name is Katie Shea, and I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I currently go to school at Kent State University in Ohio. I'll be talking about the conclusion of our time in this course. Our last night in tents was spent at the Anderson Ranch in the Tom Minor Basin region of Montana. After a night spent looking at the beautiful night sky, the yellow glow of the sun shining into my tent woke me up, as I had many times before. This time, accompanied with the occasional moo of a cow. I got up and looked at the landscape around. Snow-capped mountains, farms, and cattle surrounded us. As I stood next to my instructor, Zach, he said exactly what was on my mind. There was something comforting about the farms existing in such a uniquely beautiful area. The concept of preservation is, as you probably heard, a fundamental topic of restoration. Working landscapes, such as the landscape we spent a night in, are places where people are dependent on that land for their livelihood. These places represent conservation, the idea that people use land in a sustainable way that doesn't diminish the landscape. On the other side, there's a global plan called 30 by 30, which represents preservation. The 30 by 30 initiative is a goal that aims to protect 30% of Earth's land and oceans by the year 2030. In one of the last articles that we read, we learned about the history of private land ownership and how Patagonia Park, now Patagonia National Park, which is located in Chile, used private land policies to support the 30 by 30 initiative. This article highlighted the complexities around protecting beautiful areas by giving an example on how the strict preservation strategy was used to separate humans from the beautiful landscapes. By reading this article and staying in a working landscape, I began to question my own values of preservation. I used to believe that the way to save the planet, more or less, was to set aside land and completely prohibit human use, and only then the cure for environmental issues would be found. However, if there's one thing I've learned over the past 3 weeks, it's that conservation and preservation practices are much more colorful than that black and white way of thinking. What I mean to say is that there are many different ways we can care about the environment. That becomes easier to see when we talk about historical fidelity, the idea of wilderness, novel ecosystems, native and non-native species, assisted migration, indigenous history, and good restoration. As this presentation comes to an end, I want to challenge you all. When you see the word conservation, I want you to think about how all the different ways communities can go about caring for the natural world.
Awesome. I think similar to before, we can open it up for questions. Anyway.
As a group, I guess on the consensus where does restoration stop? Like as you brought up, you can't restore everything. Like, just if you restore part of the will be trace of all the areas. So at what point does restoration is not good? At what point it stops acceptable for areas?
We talked a lot about our end goal, or not our end goal, but sorry, the end goal of a restoration project being a durable and like sustainable ecosystem that can like go through those natural processes on its own, and then through like different monitoring and like to be like watched over, but also like with the beaver dam analogs, their goal was to create a wetland ecosystem that will go through those natural processes on its own. So that durability and sustainability is really kind of what land managers look for when
conducting restoration projects. I think also to add to that, like on our second day, of course, we visited the Berkeley Pit, which is in Butte, Montana. And a big concept that we covered that day was like, at what point does it become a question of more like, is it mitigation versus restoration? So obviously the Berkeley Pit is like part of like the Superfund projects, and most of us agreed, I think, that like that specific landscape will never really be restored to its original state. So I think that's a really good example of like what counts as, or like what we can see as like mitigation instead of restoration.
Go ahead.
Well, I have to say first, I taught several working classes, I listened to several working presentations, this is one of the very best I've been to. I taught a class for 20 years ago, ethical issues and ecological restoration. You all would have aced it. Here we had two really good instructors, but I'm really impressed with the quality of your reflections. It's very impressive. You guessed a lot of really nuanced concepts and applied it properly. So I'm going to toss out the ethical question, which it sounds like you've messed with a lot. Increasingly, ecological restoration and restoration ecology give us the tools to do restoration, but they don't answer the question of whether or not we should. And I'm just curious, when you use the whitebark pine case as one case study, there's lots of other ones. What are the kinds of things that guide you in that discussion about whether or not we should be doing restoration, and then whether or not it qualifies as included restoration? That's your final example.
Something we all did not agree on.
Okay.
So we got myriad of views on that one.
Good.
I mean, like, said, it was kind of like, there's a question of like, do these trees intrinsically value or be valued? It's just like the things they bring to the ecosystem. I say like the whitebark pine is about things that I think it helps with, what is it? Something more. It stops the ground from moving, it stabilizes banks and alpine areas, and also it can help stabilize water. But that's an ethical question, it's not really, so we all did agree on that one. So if anyone else wants to pipe in on that. It's not just me.
I can add, if we're gonna go on for whitebark pine, I know for me specifically, I hold the intrinsic value related to species such as the hatch, wait, the bird, which I brought, sorry. But if we were to move those trees or assist in migration, all that, it would have to create stress on all the other species in that environment, and that for me, like keeping the ecosystems for the species that are already thriving, I don't think it's worth the risk. So I think it's always worth considering all of the surroundings of that ecosystem.
You think we should be planting a genetically modified whitebark pine?
I think to kind of go off of what they were saying, I think the question of like where we should restore versus like where we shouldn't, and like how we can like balance those decisions, I think it's always going to be a question. I think it really depends on the area that you're looking at, the processes that's affecting, species that is affecting. For me, it's always a question. It's not something that I can produce like a strict answer on or can answer in general, but I think it's very different.
Question from home. How can we incorporate conservation into our day-to-day lives? Also, P.S. Hi, Ella. That's remarkable.
It's
Conservation. Oh, it's a tough question.
Yeah. Looking at projects that are in your local community, see what kind of values those programs have and whether you align with them and whether they have good restoration ideas.
That's what I have.
There was a big concept within Higgs's first article that we read about good restoration that involved community, and what I took out of that and had a big conversation with some of my peers about was like volunteering in your local area and how that can just really, even though it's one small tiny piece, it is a really big help, like what we did with the beaver dam analogs. Volunteering with the big watershed committee. I mean, that's just one small step that you can take.
Yeah, on that, we volunteered for a day with them, doing the VDAs, we were in animals. And the amount of change we saw, like within the day, like the water level rose like, when we say like a foot around, really around there, like some of the lakes, or something like that. It was like significant, like the amount of change you could do for one day's work in conjunction with our teams. And like just essentially like we're cutting down trees and driving like dead wood and like making these dams. That's really not a lot of work, like it's a day's work. So it's not like you don't have to like be doing this like every single day of the summer to have like a fairly large impact in these areas. Like it was significant.
It's also as simple as like voicing your opinion or just spreading awareness. Even if it's through social media or through conversation, that's always important. And if we're thinking about, you said conservation, but also sustainability, we're gonna like go there. It's, you know, lowering gas emissions, like using as little as lowering that ecological footprint as much as you can also helps. So
I think something that goes with what you just said is like just educating yourself about like the policies and the things that are going on around you. Something that we spoke about that was like a big issue with what Brody talked about with the fish kill was how like the city around, they didn't understand like what was going on. They just like took everything at the surface level, and like everybody was like really upset about it. But then like with like the proper communication, like things kind of like settled down, like people understood like what the actual goal was. So I think like just educating yourself and like being as aware as like as aware of like what's going on around you as possible really helps as well.
A concept that I started thinking about for some of our readings that I think would be very valuable to take home with you is to look at the areas around you that you really value. And when you start considering that, you can start considering what stresses face those areas and what you can do to help them.
There's a pretty significant overlap here with wildfire and disturbance events. And I'm curious if any of your perspectives shifted on wildfire and how you view wildfire, especially in terms of like adaptive management and restoration and conservation towards sort of improving our wildfire resilience.
I would say that my perspective absolutely changed. Before I learned about wildfires and wildfire, putting wildfires out there. I used to think they were really harmful, like Smokey the Bear. I always grew up like listening to him. But after learning about like things like the white bark pine and looking at the environments around you, and a lot of the articles that we read, we learned that like what you guys said, fire is needed for some ecosystems. That's needed to help mitigate non-native species. So definitely my perspective changed on this.
I felt like my perspective didn't really change, but it was somewhat a challenge. Where kind of when I was growing up, I had always been sort of shown the drawbacks behind our old policy of getting rid of all fires. You know, I remember going to Glacier National Park and seeing like a burn site and being told like this was because we just stopped. We just like prevented all fires. But then kind of going into this course, there were a few sites where it was shown that it's like it may be too far gone, or it may be at a point where it would still be better to prevent fires here, even though because if a fire did happen, it would be too destructive at this specific site. And so I'm still kind of against fire mitigation, but I guess there's like some specific sites that have like almost changed my mind.
Another question from home. Miranda talked about what the landscape environment might have looked like before our time. What was the most interesting thing that you discovered about this historical landscape that has now changed significantly? And not just to Miranda. You prompted it, but it's still, yeah.
At least for me, it was kind of like people like Yellowstone conversation. We had enough articles we were reading where they were just like, these landscapes are, or at least were culturally kind of managed, like they're not. These landscapes weren't the way they were just because there was no people around or something, like in Yosemite, for example, there was a lot of areas of like controlled burns and Native Americans did a lot of work on those landscapes to make them like essentially it was beneficial to them and the animals and they humanly positive good. And how they were culturally a landscape. That was just interesting to me because you always look at Yellowstone and you're like, oh, it's great because there's no people here. And you're like, well, there's ways that like there is things that's also not because there's some people here that like in a negative sense, like you always think of use like Yellowstone, oh, there's no people, that's great, you know, the wolves can come back, they're just gonna shoot them. And then you realize there's all like 101 ways where if there's not people here, things are not happening the way they should be, like Yellowstone is a fire adapted ecosystem. It needs fires. Like if we don't have people starting fires, it's not going to do well. Like, and that's why we had a massive burn in the 80s. Because we stopped them so much that there was so much undergrowth. And I actually had a fire that was really big and not just a small one.
Something that really stuck out to me was when we were working on the beaver dam analogs at California Creek. We were like getting like a tour of the place and the person that was like giving us the tour, Nolan, was he kind of like told us to like look up and he was like, where do you think like this river used to be at? And like all of us like looked like way up this like crevice that we were standing in and like really like where it used to be you could tell was like I don't know 40 something feet above like where we were standing. And you could tell that because of like the erosion in the little valley and also the fact that there were like dead willow like trees or willow shrubs there or like dying because willows like grow right along the edge of water. So the fact that they're that far up there really is a telltale sign of like where the water used to be. And like just seeing that was a really striking moment for me, like how much the landscape has changed. Like a few I don't know, 100 yards away, there was like a road that was like not spot as well. So that's just really put it in perspective for me.
Location. Sorry. There we go.
I have a softball question. Do you think the Wilderness Act of 1964 is a good law?
I guess starting out, we definitely discussed how vague and nuanced it can definitely be with a lot of its chosen wording on trammeled and wilderness. Add on to that.
We also, when we went to Red Rocks National Wildlife Refuge, which we didn't mention, but we learned that that wildlife refuge was enacted with that act. And what I questioned there was like, there were ranchers using the lands for cows. And they were questions of like building infrastructure and stuff like that, which is directly in opposition to the Wilderness Act. So what I questioned a lot, not just at the refuge, but like at all the sites we went to that were considered wilderness areas, was like how well they follow this law. How well they follow like the not trammeled by man. I guess, but like I don't know. I found that it's people don't use it very strictly, and then sometimes people use it very strictly. So it's just like a very fluid law that I found lacks like proper research.
Just kind of like a little bit onto that. It was like it recognizes wilderness as untrammeled by man. And I mean, as we know, indigenous peoples, like we're native to a lot of lands that we now consider wilderness. So is it truly untrammeled if people were living there before and managing their land, practices?
No, in that sense, it creates a new category.
Yeah.
Is that a good thing?
It's a more realistic definition. It's more actually accurate. I don't know if it's good or not, that's my version.
And some of us definitely value the experiences we had in some of the wilderness areas. So, I don't definitely think you can alter that.
Dan, their instructors may have trained them too well not to take firm positions on hard questions. Can we give it up one more time for Restoration Ecology? For those of you who don't know, Dan Spencer is one of the starters of this course, was one of the first instructors for work that taught Restoration Ecology. So, and wrote the curriculum many iterations prior. So has all the best questions. Thanks everyone who's on Zoom. I'll get back up in front of the camera so you can see me one more time. Thanks everyone who came on Zoom and watched these presentations. Again, thanks to our groups and our instructors and everyone for being here tonight. We will end the stream broadcast here in just a moment. For working students and guests, you're welcome to stay and enjoy. If you're of age, you can have a glass of wine or a beer. If you're not, there's non-alcoholic beverages. There's also some snacks and food. You can mingle and mix across different courses and meet each other and say hello and that kind of thing. And then we'll disperse in just a little bit. Again, it's the end of y'all's courses. So thank you so much for doing such a great job presenting. One more round of applause. Our formal presentation. Thanks so much.